This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Today we're joined once again by pollster, data scientist, and commentator Kyla Ronellenfitsch.
All right, thanks for joining me, Kyla.
Great to be with you.
Okay, so we have not been on the air with this podcast very long, but you are officially our first guest appearing for a second time. So that is some kind of special statement, I think.
So honored.
Okay, so I wanted to get you back on because there's been a lot happening at the federal level in terms of politics, because of course we have a minority parliament. We also have a budget that just landed. There's potential for an election. We even have a governor general in the hospital. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on right now. So let's get into it. So we're in pretty uncertain times right now, just in terms of the economy, in terms of our politics, in terms of everything that's going on, which has led to Canadians paying a lot more attention than they normally do to what's going on in politics. With that, it means that more people are paying attention to the fact that there's a budget right now than is usually the case. Usually this is a document that sort of gets dropped into our politics. Very few people actually pay attention to it, and then we move on. Not the case now. Can you talk about what the reaction has been to this budget from voters?
Yeah. So what my polling has found that 8 in 10 Canadians have heard at least something about it. It really is, 20% say that they've heard a lot about it. So that would be like, I don't know. I assume people reading like multiple articles. I don't fully know what to take from that larger group that says that they've heard just something about it. Have they heard about high spending? Have they heard, I don't quite know. And I think that kind of bears out in what their reaction has been as well, which is like, obviously we have a lot of polarization in our politics right now. We have kind of this contingent, let's say 40-ish% of Canadians that are kind of like a stronger conservative, 40% that are a pretty strong liberal right now, and then sort of this group in between. And we see that in the reaction to the budget as well, where you have about 40% of people that approve of it, think that it was okay, and a similar percentage of people that disapprove of it. But I think what's really notable, and I would consider this to be kind of a success of the government for the government, is that not that many people have really strong opinions about it. So you have 18% of people that strongly approve of it, just 16% that strongly disapprove. Like, that's kind of as a pollster, that something that I'm always looking at, which is what degree of polarity do we see? Because it's like, if someone only somewhat approves or somewhat disapproves of it, they probably have forgotten about it in 3 days. And it's not really something that you're going to have to actively manage and navigate on kind of a longer term basis. But it's really those people that are like, they kind of get loud on the margins. And if you have that really high, strong disapproval, which, we don't see here, that can be a problem. But I'm not really seeing that. I would say overall, the government kind of got away with the budget, okay.
What's the breakdown in terms of party support? Because obviously, anytime a government does anything, their supporters are obviously going to be more likely to like what they have done, but people in the other parties maybe not so. And as we talk about whether this budget passes, we're on a constit week right now at the time of recording, and MPs are going back into their ridings, talking to people in their communities, talking to their supporters about whether this is a good budget, whether it deserves passing, etc. So that does actually weigh into the decision making around whether they should pass this. What is the view of across the partisan spectrum of this budget?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of what you would expect. Liberals are broadly supportive or approving of it. About 80% of or 70%, sorry, of Liberal voters are approving of it. A lot of that, though, is still kind of modest, in a somewhat approved. So there might be some things that they're seeing in the budget that they're maybe not 100% about. And then conservative voters tend to be, disapproving of it. About a third are strongly disapproving. So again, I think that there's also some stuff that maybe some conservative voters that are seeing that they're like, this isn't the end of the world. And it maybe is also partly a reflection of kind of what the elite response has been to it, which is it's always, I feel like there's this old, I I don't know, truism, I guess, kind of like as a liberal in Canadian politics, which is like, if you're being attacked both from the left and the right, then maybe that's like not the most uncomfortable place to exist in, because you can give the perception that like maybe you got it like just right. Like there's been a lot of criticism that it's like too much spending, and I don't know, like it's hard to know, or maybe some of it is just like people giving Carney a bit of a benefit of the doubt to start. Like I had asked in an open-ended question why people approved or why they disapproved of the budget, and a lot of what I'm seeing in the approval is like it's a good start kind of thing. So not like I also don't know if there's any budget that could just be perceived as like, oh, you knocked it out of the park, this is a perfect budget. Like everything is always I think a mixed bag. So I would say the reaction is like fairly good. Probably some things to actively manage, and I'm sure the government has like more detailed data on like specific items of the budget and how they tested and all of that. I didn't really go into a lot of depth because this poll was more so focused on the prospect of an election and kind of questions of conservative leadership. But just kind of at like a high level, things looked okay.
I did want to ask you about sort of the news ecosystem that this budget is dropping in, because there's a lot going on. There's been, the news story about Poilievre and his comments on the RCMP. There's been, Trump constantly raising his head back up, and the talk of tariffs, and, the ads by the Premier of Ontario. And there's been a lot of stuff going on. But I did want to ask about the caucus roiling for the Conservatives, because this budget dropped, and then all of a sudden there was a floor crossing that sort of sucked the air out of the room of the budget story in general. How much did that come up, and what's sort of dominating people's minds, beyond the budget?
Yeah. So a majority of Canadians have heard at least something about that, which I think is like some of these things you see the number as a pollster and you're like, is this substantial? Like, how do I kind of define if that feels like a lot? I would kind of say, yeah, like that feels like a very notable news story in normal times. Like it feels pretty significant. What's kind of interesting, I actually haven't released this data yet, but I also asked, what did these events do to impressions of Poilievre? And I mean, people know these politicians, and especially like Pierre Poilievre, who's been in politics for so long, like people know him and they kind of know what to expect in large part, especially because like after this election, I think we saw, a pretty significant amount of change in opinion over the course of the past year, but he had this intensive period to like really stick in voters' minds. So a lot of it is you see it not really having that much of an impact on people's impressions, but and a lot of this, I'm kind of mostly interested in like, what did it do to conservative voters specifically? Like, is this going to shake up anything for the leadership review? Is this going to, how is it kind of impacting people? And I think for the floor crossing, I think it was about 20% of conservative voters said that worsened their opinion of Pierre Poilievre. So not like an enormous slide, but it's, it's something, especially again, in this kind of polarized environment where people are sticking pretty firmly in their respective sides. Yeah, it's not nothing, but some of the other stories, like around the comments around the RCMP, half of conservative voters said that improved their impression of Poilievre. So it's like,
really,
yeah, it's kind of for me as a liberal, kind of disturbing. But like, I mean, these are like the dynamics though that are like very hard, I would say, for them to navigate. Is like you have some of the things that really are exciting to a contingent of the base, not all of conservatives. And then you have those same things being like really alienating to, I would say like about a quarter of the conservative base who's like not kind of voting conservative in spite of Pierre Poilievre being the leader. But also any of the people that would consider voting conservative if he was not the leader. Like they don't like this stuff, and they are more looking for someone who is like I don't know, kind of like a normie conservative, which now would include like a Stephen Harper, which, you know, for like I came up in politics around the time when he was prime minister. That feels like a weird thing to say, but there's like a nostalgia for his style of like calm leadership, but also Doug Ford and like kind of more of like a centrist-y, progressive conservative-y vibe. Although I know he's not part of the progressive conservative contingent, but like almost now in retrospect, he sort of is.
So we're going to get into that later in the conversation because I just had so many thoughts pop into my head, but I will try and be a calm, patient person and wait till that part comes back. But I want to talk about the possibility of an election. So again, we're in a minority parliament, and you just mentioned the Harper days. That's when I was at school in Ottawa. We had minority parliaments all the time. It was always a very exciting time because the government could drop at any point, and there was always a lot of palace intrigue around whether that would happen or not. That's going to be the case here until either the Liberals, you know, bring a few more members to their side, work out some kind of parliamentary governing coalition, or there's a new election held. So we're going to have the speculation all the time. How are voters feeling about the prospect of an election? Because again, as of recording, we don't yet know that this budget is going to pass. And what is the vote split like in terms of, you know, parties? Because you would assume that conservatives would want to go to the polls more so that they could try and replace this government, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they go, oh, we just had an election, I don't want to do that. Obviously, you would suspect that Liberals are the least likely to want to go. What does it actually look like on the ground with voters right now?
Yeah, so overall, it's, again, kind of like a divisive proposition. But for Liberals, you have about 2/3 of Liberal voters that are opposed to another election. They probably feel like we just had one, and also we're in power, so they kind of are comfortable with the status quo. And you also have about 2/3 of conservatives that support having an election in, and the timeline that I gave them was before the end of the year. So basically assuming that this budget does not pass. What's really interesting though, and like what I've been really, you know, paying attention to are NDP and Bloc voters and how they feel, and also kind of what their ideal outcome of an election is. And I think that this is kind of the really interesting part of the story. And again, because we do have these like very polarized contingents that are, you know, pretty strong Liberals, pretty strong conservatives, and they are about the same proportion of the population. It really is sort of like, who could possibly switch their vote? Also, who's undecided right now and still needs to make up their mind? And among those people, there's like broad opposition to having an election. Some NDP voters, some Bloc voters, of course, are interested in it. What I also thought to be interesting was a quarter of Liberal voters do want another election. So maybe those are the like, I don't know, armchair strategists who are like, no, I think we can like pull this off, or we can get a majority of this. I don't really know. But for the most part, it's really just conservatives that have this strong appetite for another election.
The other component that I thought was interesting in your data was that people already have a bit of a preordained idea about what will happen should there be an election. So you took a look at how voters are feeling about the election, but also how they think it will turn out. So there is a big chunk of people who think it will either just result in the same thing or perhaps a Liberal majority. And there are those who don't think that. How much do you think that's actually influencing people's desire to go to the polls versus not?
It's actually, sorry to clarify, but it's actually not what they think will happen. It's what they want to happen. And this is, I think, really interesting. And having, you know, worked on, had been polling during the campaign period, I think it's like a pretty notable difference is just overall, I think a lot of the desire for change away from the Liberal Party has eroded quite substantially. So actually, I asked this question in the middle of the campaign, middle and end of the campaign, of what people thought Canada needed: more change or stability. And then I asked that again. And the desire for change, which at the time, even though, you know, the Liberals won, the desire for change outweighed stability by 4 points. And now that desire for change has declined by 8 points, which to me, and like that short period of time. That is like one of the most substantial shifts in opinion that I see in the data. Like we are seeing some change in attitudes around the leaders, but it's about a 4-point change. This is like, it's very substantial, this this change in appetite for change versus stability. So that's like a very interesting almost like level setter of where we are, and especially as we look at, you know, where the polls have been around horse race, where we don't see, you know, that enormous amount of change, or kind of like a mixed bag of what different pollsters are seeing in terms of what the vote was on election day versus what they anticipated being today. But that contextual piece has moved a lot more than the actual vote has, and sometimes you see these like metrics under the surface being a little bit of a predictor of an eventual change in horse race. I'm not sure if that'll be the case, but it's something that I'm clocking as like a very significant difference. And I think in that context where people are maybe a little bit more comfortable with the Carney government, have a bit of a stronger appetite for stability, maybe are some of their fury of like the Justin Trudeau Liberals, I think has probably dissipated. Like it probably does feel like we are in a different government. In that environment, we see a strong appetite for a continuation of a Liberal government. So when I ask people what their ideal outcome would be, 56% of Canadians say that they want another Liberal government. And most of those people, so 40% of Canadians, want a Liberal majority as their ideal outcome, whereas 35% of Canadians would say their ideal outcome would be a Conservative majority, and 9% would say a minority. So that is, again, like a very significant contextual difference versus election day. And what's really notable is how many current NDP and Bloc voters that also say that they want a Liberal majority as the outcome. So again, kind of going back to that desire for stability. So you have about 4 in 10 of both of those party voters that are saying that they want a majority, and that is, you know, for all the folks in PMO that are like working on Liberal strategy right now, is just like a very fascinating change of events, because that is not really how people felt during the actual campaign, where they were like maybe a little bit more resentful about returning the Liberals to power. Just as like for the Liberals, not for Carney, but like they were sort of, they had to be like two-minded about it, where they were like, the Liberals, but Carney.
Well, it's really interesting to me, because I think, to me, this is like the real question of the era we're in right now, because you had a 10-year government with a very unpopular PM who then very quickly got replaced. And then there's a new PM in place. And for a lot of people, I think it does feel like an entirely different government. There's a lot of the same players involved, both in, you know, the back rooms and at the cabinet table. But I think there is a very new feeling to this government that people have. And, you know, in my own background, of course, I worked for Kathleen Wynne, and it was very much the same when she became premier. She waited a bit before going to the election, but she won a surprise majority. And for a while there, people felt like this was a really different government with an entirely new approach to how it was dealing with the issues facing the public. And that really, really decreased that mood for change, which usually the only time you replace a government is if the need for change is so high that people go, yeah, let's just get rid of these people. Sometimes it's, we don't like them. Sometimes it's, oh, you've been there for 10 years. Usually that's the mark where people just get sick of whatever the option is, regardless of whether they like it or not. So I think that seems to be what's happening here. The question for me is that going to stay? Because, you know, this is still the Liberal Party, and sometimes some of the feelings people have for a party that they haven't liked until now start to come back as they start to see similar behaviors, or they start to not like where the direction is going under the new regime and all that kind of stuff. So I find that 8% really, really interesting, because I know we haven't had that much time between the election, quite frankly, but it's interesting that feeling of wanting stability has grown that much to me. Like, I don't know, it sounds like you were surprised by it as well.
Yeah. I think that was one of the more notable findings in the poll, like that, and the desire for a Liberal majority, like all of those things that having spent so much time thinking of the data within the campaign period, like it it surprised me a little bit. But also, you know, to your question of like, will this hold? I don't know. Like that, I'll do my, you know, my typical pollster spiel of like, any poll is a reflection of the moment in time. And as I was writing it, I was like, am I getting too ahead, like ahead of my skis or whatever the expression is? Like, I don't want to look so stupid if this dynamic changes in a month. Because it could, and like, who knows what events occur. But right now, in this moment in time, the environment is quite different, and that is really the only thing that we can ever know at a moment, at, you know, any moment in time. And but I can, you know, imagine if there doesn't feel like substantial progress has been made, that maybe some liberal fatigue comes back up in 6 months or a year or what have you. Like, I don't know. So part of the challenge will be to continue deliver and continue to feel like something different, and like a government that is new with fresh ideas. And I think the worst thing would be, and I don't see any evidence of this, but I think the worst thing would to ever get the impression of like, well, we've already, you know, solved that problem, or, you know, I don't get that sense at all. I think that Mark Carney has like his very detailed list of like things that he wants to accomplish and things that they'll be driving. But yeah, I don't think you ever want to show a feeling of complacency.
One thing I did want to ask you, just based on, you know, you've been polling for quite a while now, and do you think we're in an environment, a public opinion environment, where things just move faster now? Because, you know, we were talking about that 4 to the 8%, but are we just in an era now where things can shift dramatically? Obviously, we saw that in March of this year. Those numbers shifted really, really fast, and that's why we are now in the political environment we're in. But I just feel like maybe it's the Trump effect. I don't know what it is, but I feel like things just move a lot faster than I remember them moving even 10 years ago in public opinion, where you'd have, you know, a slow decline to a political party or a slow incline to a political party, and maybe a little jump during an election, but not these like constant swings between, you know, the feelings that people are having about the political process.
Well, I just think this year has just been like such a shock of a year, right? Like, you go from Justin Trudeau's resignation to like Mark Carney was, you know, generally unknown in January of this year, and then to kind of have like a brand overnight. Like, these are very big shake-up events, so it makes sense that the opinion environment then adapts around it. But at the same time, like, you look at Pierre Poilievre's favorability throughout the course of the year, like his favorables increased by 4 points, his favorables declined by 4 points, his unfavorables increased by 4 points. I'll finish the thought. Like, we had an entire election in that period of time. Like, that is not so enormous of a change in environment. So you kind of like, these rapid changes sort of, they happen in some places, and it makes sense. Like, if it depends if people are starting from zero in terms of their opinion or not. But yeah, I don't know. It's kind of hard to say. Like, I think one of the things that's interesting, and before I started working, like running Relay full time, I had been working for an American polling firm. And so I spent a few years studying opinion in a obviously hyper-polarized political environment. And what you see there is that it is like extremely difficult for opinion to change because people are in their respective camps. And that's one of the things that I think will be really interesting moving forward, because usually we have, you know, such a, you know, a pretty strong multi-party system. And that makes it easier for there to be a little bit more dramatic of changes in opinion, because there are more outlets for people to define the context. There's more places for people to put their vote. But with the NDP so weak right now, we're like kind of in a bipolar, I don't know, political environment in English Canada. And that will be really interesting to see over time, because that is quite new for us. And then we're in an environment where we're looking just at like marginal changes, in the same way that that's kind of what we pay attention to in the US. Like in the US, a 2.3 point change in vote intention is like massive. And unhelpfully for a pollster, is often within the margin of error. So you like don't even know if you're looking at a real thing. And so it'll be interesting to see if that dynamic is like also kind of what we're operating in Canada. Not to get, too ahead of myself in assuming that the NDP will stay weak. I don't know if they will, but right now they are quite weak and have a lot of rebuilding to do. So, I mean, yeah, we'll see.
So I wanted to ask about that because, to your point, this creates a bit of a two-horse race. And I have, like trauma of the 2011 election where, like Nadia said, you have a blue door and a red door, and then the orange door surge. But in theory, there's a two-horse race right now. And that was the case in the last election and could be the case in the next election. What are Canadians thinking about both Carney and Poilievre as leaders in their own right now? Yeah,
so I think one thing that is really also notable in the data is oftentimes what we see is the conservative vote pool. So people that are considering voting for the Conservative Party tends to be a little bit more strong. And by strong, I mean there usually is more people that are certain to vote for Conservative because they can't really go anywhere else. I mean, maybe they could, but they're conservatives ultimately, and so they're kind of like in their home. What we see for the Liberals right now is that their vote base is as consolidated as the Conservatives. So just as many Liberal voters are certain to vote Liberal as Conservative voters are certain to vote Conservative. Like you have these very strong kind of contingents. Most Liberal voters have a pretty positive impression of Mark Carney. Likewise, although to a slightly, lesser extent, Conservative voters tend to be like pretty approving of Pierre Poilievre. But what's interesting is kind of like that group, again, in between of people that are either not strongly attached to either party or are planning to vote for another party. And that is, I think, where all of the interest is in the environment right now, because that's where the perceptions of the party leaders is extremely relevant and is a big part of the story for like what could happen in the next election. Things that I would be thinking of as a conservative. I kind of assume that Pierre Poilievre's leadership is probably safe, but there are definitely some weaknesses, and that weakness is that for all of these people, about a third of voters who are not polarized, they really don't like him, or they tend to really not like him. And he is a much more threatening figure to these people than Mark Carney. So I had asked, a whole set of different descriptors and how applicable they are to each leader. And it's almost half of these kind of non-polarized people who think that Pierre Poilievre is scary. That's like the most strong opinion that they have. And there's actually a 20-point gap in between people that think that Pierre Poilievre is scary versus people that think the same thing of Mark Carney. But next most commonly held view that they have is that Mark Carney seems kind of like a good person. He seems competent. He seems like a leader. Kind of like this collection of, I guess, like prime ministerial type attributes that he kind of seems just, competent and can get the job done. And that is, I think, what is really interesting. Like back to our conversation about the ideal outcome and wanting a majority, but also this very strong appetite for preventing Pierre Poilievre from ever becoming prime minister. Like all of that sort of echoes the last election, but almost in a more intense way, because people's frustrations with the Liberals have declined pretty substantially.
I think it's interesting because it feels very 2006 to me. And when you use the word scary, like it triggers my memory of how people felt about Stephen Harper when he was running the first time in 2004. And, there's that famous ad about him putting soldiers on the streets, yada, yada, yada. And there's a lot of effort by the Liberals to feed into that feeling in the public. Harper, famously donned the sweater vest and warmed himself up, posed with kittens, things like that, to try and make himself feel less scary. Poilievre is doing none of that. he's going on podcasts and, spinning conspiracy theories about the RCMP and Trudeau and all these kinds of things. So I do wonder, and the other part is Carney doesn't really have like the sponsorship scandal hanging over him the way that Paul Martin did, who had a lot of similar attributes, I think, to how people feel about Carney as well. So I'm interested in that as like a redo of a campaign 20 years ago. But it seems to me like that scary piece is the piece that if you're a conservative, party strategist, that's the one you really want to get into and find some way to get around, because until that's addressed, I think he is sort of relegated to a pre-government Stephen Harper position where he's not going to get that swinging middle, if you will, to come over to him instead of Carney, no matter how frustrated they might get with, Carney's restructuring of the Canadian economy over the next couple of years, until they break through that part of him not being a scarier alternative. I think that might be a struggle for them. Do you feel like that's true?
They've clearly identified it as an issue, because you had periods in the campaign where he was suddenly smiling in press conferences, and it was like kind of unnerving. And I think what they've decided is they're not going to do it. And so I don't know, like I can kind of see the calculation of like, what is the greater risk, that we are like authentic and maybe rub some people the wrong way, but we really fire up some other people, versus we try to moderate and then get mocked for it, which also happened, right? Like I saw so many kind of like mashup videos of like him almost like remembering to smile at the end, and like obviously that's not helpful either. So it's like you would have to authentically be able to not be scary, and I don't know. I guess he hasn't wanted to do, some of these things. We also think sometimes, I think when we talk about political strategy, we sort of assume that all things are possible, that like candidates are just perfectly malleable. It just might not be possible for him to not be sharp. Like he has always been, that's always been his tone. And so I guess they've decided to just kind of like bulldoze with it. But that might be, I think, a justification for thinking of a different potential leader who, especially in this polarized environment, who maybe, I feel like I've heard this on like so many panel shows in the past week, but people who think of like addition rather than subtraction, or like people that think of like maybe being a bit of a softer figure that is a little bit more palatable to these people that maybe wouldn't pass a Pierre Poilievre conservative purity test.
What does strike me though is it's not so usually when, a politician is seen as scary or something to be afraid of, that tends to get amplified during a campaign because you're seeing more of them, you're getting to know them better. But Poilievre's numbers have they were not highest during the campaign, they're highest now. When he's, back in the House, fighting against this budget, has done his by-election, all that kind of stuff. His numbers are worse now and worsening, it seems, over the course of time. What do you think that's about? Is it people are just still, pretty aware of him because of this news cycle we're in? Or is it just every time they hear about him, they're like, oh, not for me?
I mean, it might be a reflection of like this survey was fielded over the weekend, so November 7th to 10th. So it might be partially a reflection of like this specific moment that we're in, and him having a lot of negative headlines for, quite a few weeks now. So maybe, perhaps it is that. I don't really know exactly what would have changed, like what would have made him more scary from election date. Some of it maybe is like a point of contrast to Carney, who is very much looked at as not scary. So like maybe just that leadership point of contrast that they've also had now for several months, maybe that is also putting it in a different context. I don't really know, but it's kind of an interesting change.
Well, it will remain interesting as, of course, we go towards his leadership review in the new year, because if he continues the slide, that's not a great thing for him. So I think everybody looking towards this leadership review assumes his position is safe because he is very popular within his own party. But having said that, the first time you were on the podcast, it was to tackle a similar question of a leadership review for a different party leader in Ontario, who everybody thought her position was safe and she wasn't going anywhere. We know how that turned out. That was Bonnie Crombie. She's no longer going to be the leader of the Liberal Party. So things can happen. Taking a look at Poilievre on his own now, what has been the feedback from voters that you've seen so far?
Yeah. Well, as I said before, conservative voters tend to feel pretty okay with Pierre Poilievre. I think, and there probably is, this contingent, especially younger people, particularly younger men, who are maybe more, I would say, like, politically engaged right now and more tightly aligned with him specifically and his version of the Conservative Party than maybe would exist otherwise. And that's probably a very important part of their coalition. But it isn't that, like, every conservative voter right now is like part of some Poilievre cult. Like, that is not the case. It's like 9% of Canadians both plan to vote Conservative and have a very favorable impression of Pierre Poilievre. So it's not that, that enormous. It's like a lot of people are kind of in the mix. So, or not in the mix, but just like he's ultimately, we also kind of always forget this in politics. They are, at the end of the day, politicians, and people tend to not really like politicians. So they might like him more than other politicians, but at the end of the day, a lot of his voters have kind of just a somewhat favorable view of him, or a neutral view. And I think that's a really important kind of piece of context. But they do seem like, I don't see anything in the data to point that they absolutely want a change in leader. Like, they tend to be pretty comfortable with him. And when I test some different alternatives, which, I'm sure we'll get into, he comes out ahead in all of those different matchups as the preferred person. But the one thing that is really notable, and again, like, I would say this is probably like my last of like my top 3 data points from this study that I think is like really worth paying attention to and is really interesting, and also kind of surprised me. I asked people, do you think the Conservatives would be more or less likely to win if they chose a different leader? Which is a different question from, do you want them to continue to be leader? You are thinking of, other people and the strength of his leadership kind of through a different lens. And in that context, 39% of conservative voters say that they think their party would be more likely to win if they chose another leader. 27% think that there would be no impact, and just 24% of people are like strongly defending him as a like his political appeal, which I think that is, as I wrote in my article, like, if there's blood in the water, that's it. Is that at the end of the day, partisans kind of want to win, and we can get really, partisans of all stripes can get really frustrated and impatient and over a leader if they are established as a loser. What is your point kind of being there if you are not going to win? And so in that 40%, I find that to be extremely interesting, and something that it would be kind of workable for a potential alternative. Like, if anyone comes out of the woodwork and decides that they want to kind of challenge his leadership, I think there's a strong argument to be made that he is not, you could attack him on his policies or his points of view. That probably won't get you very far with the Conservative base, but you probably have a more fruitful time arguing that he can't win, because that's a pretty, not a majority opinion, but a pretty broadly held view among conservative voters, is they see other people's reaction to him and see him as a liability and alienating to other people.
Well, it's a really interesting question, because in your data, you do similar comparisons with Trudeau and Crombie as well, because you had been polling about Trudeau in a similar way in May 2023, and less than 2 years later, he was gone. You have stuff on Crombie as well in the summer before she left. And the numbers aren't all that different between all of them, but Poilievre is actually in the number supported by more of his own people than the other two leaders had been around similar periods in their leadership. But it also speaks to the ceiling question, I think, which is what you're talking about, where people think, yeah, but can you improve? Is there room to grow, or are you on the decline now? And that loser component of it is really important. Trudeau had proved himself. He won a bunch of elections. He was prime minister for almost a decade, right? Like, he had at least a winning story to lean on and help combat that for a long time. Crombie didn't have that when she lost her election, and Poilievre doesn't have that now. So it does sort of create an opening for people.
But I didn't ask this question in 2023 when I looked at Trudeau's leadership. I am quite confident that if I'd asked that question, that the percent of people that thought that we would have a better chance of winning, not like, obviously, yes, he had won before, but I'm pretty sure people were understanding the we all remember well, but the environment, just like the water that we were swimming in spring 2023, you could feel viscerally the anti-Trudeau sentiment. So I'm sure people, even if they were kind of standing by him and they were continue to support him and maybe thought that he should continue to be leader, were understanding that he had been considerably weakened. And so that, I think, is, again, it's just kind of an interesting element of this, which is like that perception of winnability. And part of that is like having an alternative in the window. It is hard for people to anticipate, like, truly, even though I give people a description of different candidates' bios and their image, it's really hard. It's still, I think, kind of hard for people to like fully, especially for a partisan, to fully buy into another person being better, because you haven't seen them, right? Like, it's like you haven't seen them campaign. It's completely a hypothetical. So there's, of course, probably some risk aversion. But that's where, like, you would need, I think, someone to put their hand up and challenge for there to be any type of conversation around Poilievre's continued leadership. And so far, I haven't seen that. So I would assume today that he's as safe today as he was, a month ago before all of the things, all of the events.
It is interesting because I find with these things, to your point, there's a sense of what's going on the surface, but then there's also what could happen if some negative things start to take place. So, there's always an undercurrent of people going, well, I'm not too enthused about this option, but it's the one we have, so we may as well show solidarity and create some strength from that storyline. But as soon as there's an alternative in the window, or I think Poilievre's worst case scenario is that Carney cobbles together a majority and suddenly he has nothing to do as the opposition leader. Like, I think that would dramatically change the story if that were to happen before his leadership vote takes place. But, you're helping things along by putting some names out there. Now, I will say, like, these are names that people probably have in the back of their heads anyway. Again, I saw this through the OLP leadership review process. There is a lot of undercurrent of grumbling happening that maybe didn't make it out to the media, but was happening within partisan circles in the party. And I'm sure that is happening in the conservative movement right now. And some of these names are probably being brought up as well. So you did some polling on some alternatives and what that would look like. You want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So I looked at 5 people. I will say that I kind of regret not including like an even more kind of, we'll say like a new agey conservative, like a kind of the new guard and the more like internet-y conservatives. I did include Melissa Landsman. I don't know if she like qualifies necessarily, but like she would be kind of like the strongest person, or the person that is like, I would think, most strongly associated with Poilievre and like his style of politics. But I also kind of had a sense a little bit of the data and wanted to take a look at also some like really prominent kind of more mainstream conservatives. So I also looked at Jason Kenney, Michelle Rempel-Garner, Peter MacKay, and Doug Ford. Michelle Rempel-Garner is maybe like halfway in between a like Poilievre era and like a Stephen Harper. I would say she's kind of like the average of the two. But what I find is like among all Canadians, all of these candidates win out. So I tested them all as head-to-head matchups between like, if you had to choose, who would you rather vote for? Among the general population, the alternative candidates beat out Pierre Poilievre. But as I always say in my leadership articles, who cares about the general population? It only really matters what your voters think. And even separate from the candidates, I also tested a set of attributes, like what kind of candidate would they be interested in? And what's interesting is for those conservatives who are have a really strong, like have a very favorable opinion of Poilievre and who plan to vote for the party, they kind of just want more of the same. Like their most in-demand attributes is someone who is similar or has the same politics as Pierre Poilievre. It's also kind of relevant that they would have the same politics as Stephen Harper, but Poilievre really kind of is the most kind of considerate or the most significant consideration of like the kind of person that they want. As you sort of move down the degree of I don't know, intensity of I would say not necessarily the conservatism, but their intense attachment to Poilievre. When you look at people that have kind of more of a moderate view of Poilievre, it's still relevant that, you know, maybe he's sort of someone that is similar to Pierre, or he or she would be someone similar to Pierre Poilievre. But also that's where you start to see people having a demand or showing a demand for someone that's maybe more similar to Stephen Harper or more similar to Doug Ford. And then when we look at this third group of people that are the 19% of Canadians that say that they become more likely to consider the Conservatives if Pierre Poilievre wasn't the leader, that's when you start getting at some of these like softer features that Pierre Poilievre hasn't really shown an ability to do, which is be more collaborative with the Carney government, be less confrontational than Pierre Poilievre, be more similar to Stephen Harper, be more similar to Doug Ford is kind of what they have in mind. So that's kind of like the overall appetite of what they're looking for. And you see that reflected in then who is kind of piquing interest among these alternative candidates. So, you know, Pierre Poilievre is the preferred candidate overall among the Conservatives. I think what's interesting is that Doug Ford is preferred by about a third of current Conservative voters if they had to choose between Poilievre and Ford. So he kind of stands out as the front runner, which I think makes sense because of, you know, how prominent he is on like in the political landscape right now. Like that's kind of a more concrete point of comparison of leadership styles, being that they're happening at the same time. And but also as we start to get kind of into, again, these like softer Conservatives and people that are only considering the party without Pierre Poilievre, then we also see Peter MacKay performing quite well, Michelle Rempel-Garner doing quite well, and by well I mean like 75 to 80% of people saying that they would support those candidates over Pierre Poilievre. So yeah, kind of you see this appetite for like a little bit more of like a mainstreaming, a little bit more of like a centrist type candidate. And overall among kind of the general population and among these different segments of Conservative voters, Melissa Lantsman performs the worst out of the set, which I just assume is like part of the descriptor I gave was like, she's a pretty strong Poilievre supporter. Like I don't think that you can dispute that. She's, I think, been probably like the second most important spokesperson in that government. So I think probably she just doesn't embody the like change that those people have an appetite for. And then again, last but not least, Jason Kenney is kind of I don't know, second last after Melissa Lantsman.
Do you think it's interesting though, because it becomes a question of like, will there be enough contrast for them if they were to go to a different option that wasn't Poilievre, right? Like how far do you have to peel back from the intense version of conservatism that he's offering before you get to say like a Doug Ford that is palatable, but is it distinguishable enough from Carney? You know, I think this might be part of the calculus for Conservative voters as well, as we need to actually be a different party than the Liberal Party, though. And with Carney eating their lunch on a lot of things and coming off as a bit of a, you know, Louis Saint Laurent liberal or Brian Mulroney progressive conservative. Like he's that type of leadership model, and it does sort of it removes some of the room for, you know, potential candidates to fill that void going forward. And they would have to rely on, oh, we're just sick of the liberals actually at this point to take over that mantle. So, you know, there may be some strategy to what Poilievre is doing to try and carve out his own lane that is somehow still acceptable to enough of the population. It's a question of whether he has, you know, enough of the population to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really valid consideration as well. You don't want to just like offer the same thing. So maybe there's like a different candidate that I like completely didn't test. That is, I don't know. I try to think of like what is, I hold, or I don't know. I think there's like a lot of credibility to kind of the argument that like people sort of look for the alternative to what they had before. And so I think part of that is thinking of what would be, I don't think it's very apparent just yet. Like, I don't think people have seen enough of Mark Carney to know truly what his weaknesses are, like what those alternatives would be. But maybe it's like, I don't know, a blue collar conservative or something. I don't know. That would be like the most kind of like brand wise, the most like,
yeah, for
strong
sure.
alternative. But like, who is that person? I don't know. But I'm just like inventing them in a lab. That's like kind of what I would think of. In the same way that like Mark Carney was a pretty perfect, like he is kind of the made in the lab alternative to very much not Justin Trudeau, but also very much not Pierre Poilievre. Like he really, we as liberals kind of lucked out with him, and also that he performed to the level of like his experience suggesting. But when I was thinking through, you know, a year and a little bit ago of like who would be that person that I could imagine doing well, because again, you're like only operating in hypotheticals. That is sort of what I felt was like that profile makes the most sense to me in terms of like the storytelling and stuff that you could do. Whereas that became a little bit more murky, I think, for Poilievre in terms of what he offers that is substantially different. Not like obviously he's offering things that are different, but I mean that are answering to a deficit. You know, maybe just obviously what they tried to do was answer to the deficit, which is like of the liberal brand. But he's also just a politician, and like it's kind of, I don't know. I think he's the luck of the draw was unlucky, I think, for him in lots of ways, and then he didn't help himself in obviously a lack of pivot, and also just the type of politician that he's been throughout his career.
The most interesting thing to me with your sort of head-to-head of options beyond Poilievre, and in terms of actual conservative voters and how they feel, is when you go to a leadership review, of course, you have to get a certain number. Now, the way the question's posed is you're actually voting yes or no to a review, not yes or no for Poilievre. But whatever that number is, everyone, all the pundits will quickly do the math of like, okay, your support number then is the reverse of that. So if 34% of people want a review, you know, it's the reverse of that. And your data here is really interesting to me because it starts to create the universe of what that non-support number looks like. And if it's anything below 80, that starts to become a problem. So maybe he doesn't stop being leader that day, but it starts to become something that slowly leaks support away from him. Most leaders who have had leadership reviews in the last year have not done very well either. That's the other part of this. So it's not even just Poilievre in general. There's an ecosystem out there right now where people are not very happy with the options on the table, and they're not seeing a lot of change taking place. So they're voting accordingly during these reviews. So there is still a danger, like based on your data here, it does suggest while he has a lot of support in the party, there is room for a significant contingent to say, actually, we want something different. And I think that's where the danger really lies.
Yeah. So among that kind of group of, I would say, strong Poilievre conservatives, like people who have a very favorable opinion of him, 79% would choose him over the 21% that would choose Doug Ford. Again, that like it is when you are trying to poll among the general population and try to like cast into what the membership thinks, it's very imperfect, right? Like the amount of people that are actually conservative members that show up in a poll is like inconsequential to the point of like, you can't really pull out that group. You don't even know if it's representative, but you can look at like the strongest partisans and try and assume or think that that will be kind of reflective. So, you know, some people, I guess, would choose an alternative option, but I wouldn't want to say at all that that would be like approaching 80% in a review. Like, I have no idea. I also don't know the conservative voter base in like any intimate way. So I kind of assume when I look at conservative commentators and friends of mine that work for conservatives, I kind of take them at their word that they think that he's pretty safe, but maybe he shouldn't be. I don't know.
Okay, so just as we wrap up here, I want to get your take on, you know, what sort of trends you're going to be looking at leading into the new year, what issues you're sort of focused on with your research going forward, because we are sort of already there at the end of the year, so we are looking forward now. So what does that look like for you?
Interesting. I'm actually taking a bit of a different lens. I think I try to like so just like this poll was, you know, self-funded. I didn't do this on behalf of anyone else. I do it for my newsletter, which is called Relay with Kyla Ronellenfitsch. And also, as I always say, because I'm Snoopy and these are the questions that I want to ask. And I just, you know, I like to do the kind of partisan research that like maybe we would do within the party, but I am, you know, I'm not doing it for the party. So I like to do the kind of, again, kind of nosy research. But I try to do a mix of like, you know, I want to do partisan research, but I also want to focus on sort of big questions. And one of those that I've really been focused on and really have been for the past like few years is this massive generational shift that we are seeing with young people and their political ideology. And I spent a lot of time really focused on this in the US. And now I want to spend more time kind of unpacking that in Canada. So I'm just in the field now with like a really significant deep dive among young voters. And so I'll be doing some writing on that. And also if anyone, you know, is interested in the full report, that I won't release everything on my newsletter, so you can get in touch with me. But that is like one of those big picture things that I think we really need to understand. And also I get really frustrated with the like oversimplification, like the stories that are almost too easy to tell, which is like right now it's all young men are, you know, suddenly red-pilled extreme conservatives, and that is just not true. And it is also unhelpful as like a political strategist to just think that, you know, anyone on like the center or left can write off young men. Like that's an insane proposition. And also I think that young women are very misunderstood politically. And so this will be kind of like a deep dive of some different elements of their politics, their perceptions of Canada. I'm also digging into some of the kind of like Maha type questions, as we've seen in the US. A lot of the entry point, almost like the red pill version for women, is through conversations around like relationships and family, but also conversations around health. And so if you can get like a young woman to not believe or to believe that like birth control is poisoning her, then you are, you know, halfway on the path to like convincing her to vote conservative. It's like a very interesting way, whereas like young men's path to conservatism or like extreme versions of conservatism has looked quite differently. But a lot of these conversations are happening, you know, online. So I'm looking at that. I'm looking at differences around kind of impressions of relationships. I will say this is the first time in a survey that I've ever had as like a relationship status. I've had situationship as an option. And so far in my fielding, it's like a depressingly not insignificant amount of young Canadians that consider themselves to be in a situationship. So I look forward to seeing that final data. But yeah, it's that's kind of where my focus is for at least right now. That is my anticipated focus for the rest of the year and kind of going into January.
All right. Well, I'm very excited to read all of that, of course, because these are all issues I'm really interested in. So that is great. We'll have to have you back on again in the new year, of course. But thanks so much for joining me today.
That's great.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.